and the BB versus Law fight continues. No off-screen. Start the chapter and it's on. No more wasting time. I love it. Unlike in Wano, the tension of this fight is handled pretty well too, and Law activating his awakening pretty much immediately at the beginning of the chapter just shows how high the stakes are. And so now as we continue to follow Luffy and we're also following what's going on with Law, I wonder if this could mean that we're also getting an update from Kid pretty soon. I feel like we're rapidly moving towards one of these chapters ending with a final panel that reveals Vegapunk's true appearance, and then after we get that, it's just going to be like a massive lore dump. On a similar note, Bonney reveals something that I think is pretty important, pretty major, which involves a very special race, and so that comment just triggered a bunch of connections in my mind, so we're going to be going over all of the implications of that as well. We get confirmation that the characters that kidnapped Pudding were Kuzan and Van Ogre. Kuzan officially looks like a pirate now, with that 18th century shirt. But then also, at first glance, the contents of the cover page end up creating a chronological conflict in regards to the content of the chapter, because Van Ogre and Pudding are featured in both. So the only way we can make sense of this chronologically is to view the cover story as happening in the past. But then the question becomes, okay, how long ago in the past did the cover story happen? Was it a couple of weeks ago? Was it a couple of days ago? Was it a couple of hours ago even? Because now we know that Van Ogre has a new ability that allows him to cover pretty long distances in a short amount of time. So I feel like him teleporting himself plus an additional person from island to island wouldn't really take that long. Kind of goes along with his nickname slash epithet being supersonic. Plus the outfit that he's wearing in the cover page appears to be the same one that he's wearing in the chapter. But then again, Pudding is actually dressed differently in the chapter than she is in the cover page. Regardless, I feel like Van Ogre was the perfect candidate to send to Whole Cake Island, because he can just use his ability, get in and get out, you know, just get those copies of the poneglyphs and just immediately disappear. It's the perfect ability to do a speed run with. And speaking of that, maybe not so coincidentally, Yasopp's nickname, his epithet, is Chaser. So a fight between the two of them is probably going to be about Yasopp being able to predict where Van Ogre is going to teleport next so that he can snipe him. So that'll probably involve some degree of future sight observation hockey, you know, some degree of being able to outpredict your opponent, and so that would lead into Usopp being able to do the same thing. I actually read a theory about that a while back about how Usopp's lies and how they become true is actually sort of a subconscious manifestation of future sight observation hockey that he's just not aware of. Now the continuation of the BB versus Law fight opens up with Blackbeard charging up a Gura Gura punch, and Law appears to know exactly what's coming because he tells Penguin and Chachi to get in the water to provide some cover. Plus he also name drops Hakugan, which is this guy in the mask here that we didn't have a name for before, and so Hakugan in Japanese means snow goose, which goes along perfectly with the theme of Law's crew, which is that of animals that live in really cold weather. Like you can find them in the North and South Poles. They have some connection to the Arctic or Antarctic regions of the world. Like even the name of Law's submarine is the Polar Tang. And so as the members of Law's crew get into position, Law activates Re-Room, again, just going straight for the awakening. And so an important reminder here is that Re-Room is actually a room that Law can attach to his opponent with an added effect. So in his fight against Big Mom, the added effect that he used, that he activated, was silence, to shut her up. Now in this chapter, the effect that he's designating to the Re-Room is amputate. And so that's why Law is able to cut Stronger in half long distance while being all the way down on the island, on the ground, without having to be inside of the room itself. Now despite the attack taking Teach by surprise, he's actually able to pull out a counter that actually ends up exposing a weakness to Law's room that I didn't know that it had before. And that's the fact that apparently, after punching the air with the Quake fruit, that punch from Teach is strong enough to break through Law's room and completely deactivate it. Because you see the power of the Quake fruit break through the room and hit the people on the island and actually crack the ground. So it just reminds me a lot of Marineford, where Aokiji tries to freeze Whitebeard using Ice Ball, but then Whitebeard cracks the ice ball itself with the power of the Gura Gura no Mi. Because as Aokiji mentions, you can't freeze the vibrations of the power of the Quake fruit. So it's the vibrations of Blackbeard's Devil Fruit that are actually strong enough to break through Law's room. We get a brief callback to Doc Q's introduction back in Jaya with the exploding apples that he gives to people that are nice to him. And I think it's worth mentioning that at least back in Jaya, not all of the apples exploded, right? So some of them were bad, some of them were good apples or normal apples, because Luffy ate one and it didn't do anything to him. And so Doc Q recognized that by saying that Luffy was lucky. So I think it's fair to say that it's Doc Q's way of sort of testing somebody's destiny. And so that kind of goes back to supporting the idea of one of the main themes of Blackbeard's crew being that of predestination, which is another reason for why I think Kuzan is actually undercover, because he believes in freedom and people choosing what they want to do with their lives. He tells Robin in Postinius Lobby, "Could you please promise me that you're going to show me with the way you live whether Saul was wrong or right about letting you live?" Now, before the apple bombs can reach the ground to explode, Shachi, who was told to provide cover, takes a giant gulp of seawater and then is able to go, "Squirtle, squirtle!" Kaboom! So identifying that the Blackbeard pirates have a massive weakness to water, the plan here is to sink Blackbeard's ship, aboard of which happens to be Pudding, who is also a Devil Fruit user, so I'm guessing she's gonna drown too, if the plan succeeds. Now, something else I learned this week is that polar bears can perceive a wider range of sound frequencies than humans can, and so Beppo makes use of that ability, or it could be some type of observation hockey, to tell John Barch to provide Law with some cover as Van Ogre comes in there to snipe him. It's kind of cool to see Law's crew in action, you know, coordinating with each other. Just to be able to act as a defensive unit is pretty cool. I mean, they still kind of suck when you compare them to the Straw Hats, because Oda can't give them too much shine because they're not the main crew of the story. But at the very least, thanks to their showing in this chapter, I can look at this and say, okay, it makes sense why and how Law has gotten as far as he has with this crew. Apparently Blackbeard isn't finished falling yet, and so Law coats his sword with K-Room and uses it to extend his sword. I'm assuming he also added anesthesia to it, and we get another showing of Shock Ville landing on a Yonko. Now, Law still has Puncture Wille available in his arsenal, you know, in storage, so you can still use that. But the thing here is that he's using like these ultimate awakening attacks, and that's not good news, because the way that Oda typically handles Blackbeard fights is that he always shows Blackbeard's opponent sort of getting the upper hand, dealing some damage to him in the beginning portion of the fight, but then Blackbeard activates the Yami Yami and he just turns it around. So that's honestly what I think is going to happen here. In fact, that's kind of where we leave off. We sort of get this panel here that is sort of like a visual echo of Whitebeard versus Roger in a way, except that instead of them using broken levels of hockey to clash, they're using broken Devil Fruits to do so. And so of course Oda decides to leave us hanging as Blackbeard activates Kurazu, or Black Vortex, whatever you want to call it. I do agree with some comments that I've seen floating around online that this could be an excellent opportunity for us to learn more about Teach's body and why it's so abnormal and what makes his body strange and weird as declared by Marco and Marineford. I feel like that has to happen here because I noticed a pattern, and that's the fact that every time Oda shows us Blackbeard in the story, we always end up learning something new about him. After I saw Van Ogre shoot John Bart and then John Bart tank the shots, I was like, is it confirmed if either of them have armament hockey? So I went to the wiki to look it up, and it turns out that it's not. The answer is no. Neither of them are confirmed to have armament hockey, which I guess Van Ogre not having it kind of corresponds with Usopp not having it either. Also, this chapter kind of seems to confirm the idea that Van Ogre's teletransportation ability or warping ability, the scope of it is limited by the scope of his vision, by how far he can see. Because in this chapter, he looks up at Blackbeard and he teleports over to him, right? But it seems like he needs to look before he warps. And the line that Law has when he tells Blackbeard that, wow, like all of your commanders have Devil Fruits, wow, so I guess the sea is a huge weakness for you. I think that kind of supports the idea that because we've never seen a Devil Fruit user actually drown in this story, I think that sort of scene or that moment is going to be reserved for Teach and possibly members of his crew, right? That we're actually going to see him, at least Blackbeard, drown to death. Again, we get a shot of Pudding in this chapter, and we still don't know if her third eye ability has awakened yet or not, but I just find the circumstance that she's in those panels to be sort of like karma in a way, because it really reminds me of the situation that Nami was in and Luffy was in back in Whole Cake Island under the authority of a different Yonko. Also, regardless of whatever comments are made in this section of the chapter about Big Mom, until I see an actual body, I just don't believe that Big Mom is dead. Like, straight up, like I don't believe that, especially not in One Piece where Oda has struggled to kill off even minor characters. Because I have that memory of her falling into the hole in my mind. And as she's falling, she yells out something like, Don't think this is going to be enough to kill me. So, until I see a body. We also get a panel of Sakazuki Akainu in this chapter, and he's being informed about the ongoing fight between Blackbeard and Law, and we get the name reveal of the island that they're fighting in. So I find the name of the island to be very fitting to the current events that are happening there at the moment, because it's winner take all, right? As Law and Blackbeard said, whoever wins this fight gets the road poneglyphs of the other person, and gets that much closer to finding the One Piece. And I was snooping around recently, and I noticed that the cliffs, or the hills, on Winter Island looked very similar in appearance to some cliffs that we've seen before in another island. And those are these right here. So if you take away the fire, if you take away the flame, those hills look very similar to the ones that we see in this chapter, right? So I thought about it, like, you know, because that island was an island that we saw, that we know was in the New World. We saw it right before the time skip, and we saw Blackbeard there, and we saw Bonney there, and we saw Akainu in that island as well. So I thought about it, like, could it be the same island? But then I noticed that, you know, that island that's on fire, that as of yet I think is still unnamed, has like sort of like Native American architecture, because we see some totem poles and constructions that we just haven't seen in Winter Island yet. So it's probably not the same island, but the hills look very similar. I was also trying to figure out which Marine was on the other side of the Dendenmushi speaking to Akainu, because we can clearly see that he has a mustache. So I was thinking, like, could it be Stainless or Momonga? Maybe one of the rear admirals who has that kind of design for a mustache. It's interesting that Akainu says, "And here I am once again waiting for a fight to conclude." So when he says like another fight, is there another fight currently going on that he's waiting for to end? Or was he referring to the time where he was waiting for the Wano fights of the Supernova versus the Yonko to end? We go back to Egghead, and we get a shot of Godzilla there in the background of the establishing shot. And then we also see that Oda continues to make use of his SBSs, because Bonney has used her powers to turn Luffy into a 70-year-old version of himself, which could be considered a continuation of this drawing that Oda made in an SBS of older Luffy. It'd be interesting to find out how old Chopper is supposed to be in this, because he doesn't really fit his SBS design, but Jinbei totally does. Like, we've seen Chow Jinbei before, and this is exactly what he looks like. So logic would also dictate that if Jinbei had a seraphim, this is the appearance that it would have. So like I said last week, Bonney's emotional reaction to the Sentinel, the police Kuma, was questionable, because we know that the real Kuma is actually with Dragon, with the revolutionaries. The point here is that Kuma's appearance has the power to trigger everybody. It triggers Bonney because it reminds her of her father, but at the same time it also triggers Luffy and Chopper because of the incident that happened 2 years ago in Sabaody Archipelago. Yamero. Yamero. So young Jinbei starts talking about what he knows about Kuma, and I think, like, for the most part, I think we should take this with a huge grain of salt. I mean, I don't doubt that part of what he says is true, but I think the information that Jinbei has is, I think, in part propaganda by the government. Because we have other characters calling Kuma a tyrant, and Bonney says that he wasn't, and then Bonney also says that Kuma hated the government. By the way, the lightsaber that Bonney gets in this chapter reminds me a lot of Kizaru's light sword that he uses in Sabaody. Lots of callbacks to that arc in this chapter. So if Kuma was a king that opposed the world government, I feel like that alone would give the government enough of an excuse to come up with all these lies about how Kuma ruled, and make up that he was a tyrant, he was an evil king that needed to be subdued, that needed to be put under control by the government. I think it's noticeable that the person with the highest credibility in terms of who Kuma was, right, and what he was like, is Bonney, right? So I think back at the previous chapter when she gets a flashback of her dad, and the image is that of a loving, very caring, joyful father. Versus the image that Jinbei has, that is a construction of propaganda. Another important point that gets raised here is that Bonney says that she doesn't understand why somebody like Kuma would volunteer to lose their mind, to lose their freedom for the world government, right? Why become a mindless cyborg for them? And so I think the answer to that is pretty obviously blackmail. I think the world government was using Bonney to blackmail Kuma into doing all these things, into volunteering. And of course, the main reasoning for that comes from a line that Akainu says to Bonney. He says, "When I heard that you had escaped the world government." So why would the world government keep Bonney captive Well, I think the answer is to blackmail Kuma. So a good theory here is that the government was holding Bonney hostage or holding her captive as a way to force Kuma into agreeing, into volunteering, quote unquote, to accept the experimental procedures / the body modifications that eventually turned him into a mindless cyborg. Now, the thing about that, though, is that if there is no upside to this, then Dragon looks really bad, because we know that Kuma was a member of the revolutionaries. So the fact that, I mean, Dragon had a friend, in this case Kuma, who was being blackmailed by the government. If Dragon didn't do anything, if he didn't take action to try to help his friend who was being blackmailed by the government, then yeah, Dragon looks horrible. I mean, he looks really bad. He looks weak even. But this chapter gives us an answer to some stuff that's been going on behind the scenes, and that's the fact that Dragon has contact with Vegapunk. So we hear Dragon having a conversation with Shaka by the end of the chapter, and the tone of their conversation makes it obvious that this is not the first time that the two have spoken to each other. It also reminds me of when we saw CP0 and they were saying that the Kuma Seraphim was causing them problems, or like was a problem child, was sort of acting up. So I feel like maybe there's a little bit of free will still inside Kuma, and if that's the case, maybe that has something to do with maybe a deal that Dragon made with Vegapunk to make the effects on Kuma's mind reversible. Because again, if Dragon really didn't do anything to at least try to protect Kuma as his friend, then he looks horrible. There's even a line in Thriller Bark when Kuma realizes that Luffy's crew is very loyal. Kuma's conclusion is that, wow, Luffy really does have very loyal friends. But it's not really that surprising given that he's Dragon's son. So Dragon must have really loyal friends because he must have some degree of loyalty to them as well. So again, I'm pretty sure that Dragon must have called up Vegapunk to come up with an agreement on making the modifications on Kuma's mind reversible. So I'm sure that Bonney will get back her real father at some point. Unless, of course, Vegapunk ends up dying, as he suspects that he will, because he says his death is imminent. In which case, if Vegapunk does die, I suspect that the task of reverting Kuma and bringing him or getting him back to normal will be up to Frankie. Now, probably the most important part of the chapter, at least for me, is the revelation that we get from Bonney when she says that Kuma belonged to a special race. So I'm willing to bet that Kuma is actually half Lunarian. And so there's a couple of reasons for why I think that. The first is the fact that the feature that gets stressed, that gets highlighted over and over about Kuma, is his durability. He was able to withstand ruthless attacks during 2 years, in order to protect the Sunny. In Reverie, St. Charlos refers to him as the invincible Kuma. In this chapter, we learned that Vegapunk took an interest in this durability feature of his, so they started using him as a guinea pig to create soldiers for the government. Who does that remind you of? King, right? King was in Punk Hazard being experimented on because of his durability. In fact, when Kaido frees King, he tells him, you better come with me because if you don't, the government is never going to give you up. So one of the things that we know about Lunarians, according to Queen, is that they can survive in virtually any kind of environment. So think about it in terms of upgrading weapons. If Kuma is half a Lunarian and he is what the first batch of pacifistas are based off of, then what would be the next step? What would be the next logical upgrade to that? Well, a batch of pacifistas that are based off of full Lunarians, right? Which is essentially what we have now. It's why the Kuma models were discontinued and now we have the Seraphims. Now you remember that during his fight against Zoro, King has an elasticity feature as well, where he's able to pull his neck back and then shoot his entire face into the ground like a slingshot. And so that elasticity feature was never explained, so we're just kind of left to assume that maybe his body is partly made out of rubber. By the way, if you look back at the pre-time skip and you notice how Kuma blocks attacks, the anime actually shows a rubbery defensive feature on his palms that was never fully explained either. You see it when Zoro attacks him in Thriller Bark, and we also get it in Sabaody with a rubbery sound effect when Luffy tries to connect a punch in Gear 2nd on Kuma's palms as well. Also in chapter 1033, there's a moment when Zoro stabs King in the abdomen, and after he does so, King explodes. So that self-destruct feature definitely reminds me of the pacifista doing the same thing back in Sabaody after they get defeated. Another bit of supporting evidence that points to Kuma being half a Lunarian is the Bible that he is often seen carrying. So sometimes the design on the cover of Kuma's Bible changes, but the one that stands out the most is the picture of what appears to be a sun goddess that is surrounded by wings. And so you can argue that the wing patterns that we see on the book are actually referencing the wings of the 3 races of moonfolk that we found out about during the NL cover story. So of course I'm referring to the Burkans, Shandia, and Skypians, because we all know they came from the moon. And speaking of Skypia, we find out that due to the ability to control atmospheric temperature, Vegapunk is able to make use of the pyrobloin in the air to create the type of clouds that make up sky islands. And this also kind of explains how Vegapunk knows so much about sea stone and is able to conduct research and experiments regarding sea stone, because pyrobloin is the main component in sea stone. Now we know that pyrobloin actually comes from volcanoes, so now I'm wondering if there's a volcano nearby, aside from the one that's back in Wano, which currently appears to be inactive. Then again, the clouds seem to be coming out of a bottle in the first floor, and the panel where we see a giant Game Boy Advance in the background. Another connection that I made here came from the mention of an anti-gravity device that's part of the robot, because to me, when I hear the word gravity in the series, like, I automatically connect it with Devil Fruits. During his fight against Ace, Blackbeard says that darkness is gravity, and it has the power to pull devil fruits in. And then in Enies Lobby, before Kaku and Khalifa eat their devil fruits, it's mentioned that the power emanating from the fruits is kind of like gravity as well. And this is the arc where we're supposed to learn the truth about devil fruits. So each time gravity is mentioned, I just kind of make a mental note. On that note, unfortunately, we don't get an update on what it was that Zoro was going to ask Vegapunk about or for. All we find out is that he's going to be staying in the Sunny, or on the Sunny, along with Brook, because he just doesn't trust Lilith. Now before that, as the Straw Hats head upward, we learned the name of the floors. We learned that the bottom floor is called the Fabrio phase, and then the top floor, or you know, the part of the egg, I guess, that is sort of cracked open is called the Labo phase. So if I'm not mistaken, both Labo and Fabrio are Latin words. Fabrio means I make, or forge, to forge something. And then labo means I work. So words like laboratory and labor have the same Latin root, which means to work. And speaking of words, we learned that the adjustable boots are called dom shoes. And so the suffix of dom, D-O-M, relates to dignity, but also the state or fact of being free, which kind of makes sense because they're flexible and adaptable to the person's measurements. And so of course we also have the suffix dom, dom, at the end of the word freedom or kingdom. Now inside of the egg structure, we see that it says Punk Records. And so at first I thought it just probably means like, you know, like historical records or, you know, records that contain a lot of important information. But then I remember reading a theory on Reddit about how Kid might actually be Vegapunk's grandson, because number one, Kid's attacks have the word punk in them. Number two, this is a shot of Kid when he was little, so it could be that he was following in his grandfather's footsteps, trying to be a mechanic, some kind of an inventor working on a robot. And then of course we have Shaka with the Daft Punk helmet that pretty much matches the Daft Punk design of Killer's helmet as well. So now I'm wondering if like the phrase punk records could be related to music, sort of like Kid having a punk rock theme to himself and his crew. So we move on and we find out the real reason for why Zoro and Brook decided to stay aboard the Sunny, and that is to avoid getting into these cringy space outfits. No, I'm just kidding, no. So Nami looks like Nami, you know, she's always wearing something skimpy. Robin's outfit reminds me a lot of her Beast Pirate outfit that we saw back in Onigashima. Frankie looks like a toy that you wind up at the top, which I thought was kind of like funny and ridiculous. I really don't like the fact that Usopp's outfit is just one piece. Pun intended, maybe. Now he looks cool from the waist up, you know, because he has the jacket and the shades and the cool beanie. But then you just look at the full body design and it looks like he's wearing baby pajamas. So I actually agree with Sanji on this because he doesn't like his own outfit either. But I think the reason for why he got the short end of the stick is because he already had a pretty cool quote-unquote spacesuit, right? Like his Germa suit. This is how Sanji looks cool in that kind of gear. So I don't think Oda wanted to repeat something like that for him. But ultimately, I am going to stick with the people that are on the lower floor in terms of outfits, because I think Bonney looks really good, I think Luffy looks good, and I think Chopper looks good, and I think Jinbei's Hawaiian shirt really suits his personality. So yeah, those designs I'm fine with. I do want to highlight this bit of dialogue that Vegapunk has as he's speaking to Dragon, when he says that being a genius means being able to see even what your own future contains. So the obvious question here is, does he mean this figuratively or literally, right? Can he literally see into the future as some type of observation hockey, as we sort of alluded to in the beginning of this video with Usopp's lies coming true? Because if it turns out that Vegapunk actually can see into the future, then this kind of explains, again, why Franky's bounty poster was changed to a picture of the Sunny. Because as I sort of proposed before, it could be that by the end of the arc, Franky actually decides to stay behind an Egghead. And the way that he's able to do this is by using the Sunny as a vessel for his essence, right? Kind of like Vegapunk is using the satellites or the other punks as vessels for his main body. But he's not really there. I mean, he's kind of there, but he's not. So maybe Franky decides to do the same thing with the Sunny, and that way he can travel with the crew to Laugh Tale, while at the same time stay behind an Egghead to work on things that might have a really, really big role in the end game of the story. So given what Vegapunk says at the end of this chapter, it got me to think that maybe he looked into Franky's future and he noticed that Franky would eventually want to fuse himself with the Sunny. And maybe he slipped in that picture to the world government or to Morgan's, right? And he said, like, publish this, because I know that Franky eventually is going to end up fusing himself with the ship, just to sort of get that mental process started or going. Lastly, for real now, I just want to make a comment about something that Bonney says in the official translation, which to me, again, was the most important part of the chapter. She says, "My father told me that he was from a special people." So I talked about the potential idea of Kuma being half a Lunarian, but then I also thought, like, could he possibly also be a D? There's a theory that the people of D, the initial D is not actually the letter D, but it's actually the symbol for the half moon, half Lunarian. So maybe the special people that Bonney refers to in the chapter actually means the people of D. Now, aside from the stuff that I've already mentioned, I only have 2 bits of evidence that point to Kuma being a D. The first one is during Reverie. Actually, both of them are during Reverie. So Sabo says, "Look what's being done to our comrade, to our kind-hearted Kuma." And the picture that Sabo has in his mind of Kuma is a picture of Kuma smiling, which we know is a feature of the people of the D clan, that they often smile even when their life hasn't been easy. And then the last bit of evidence that I have comes from a conversation in Dressrosa when Law is talking to Sengoku, and Law lets Sengoku know that he has the D initial. And I think it's Sengoku who says that the people of D, they always lead a checkered life. And so that's like what starts Law on this path of wanting to find out more about the will of D and what that means. And so that aspect of the checkered life is highlighted through Law, right? And through him wanting to learn more about the will of D. Now, in the anime, during Reverie, when we see Kuma, the narrator literally says that when it comes to Kuma, no one has led a more checkered life than his. So if it turns out that Kuma's actually a D, then this chapter is full of people that have the D initial, right? Because we have 2 Ds fighting in the beginning with Law and Blackbeard. Luffy is in the chapter as well. The chapter actually ends with Dragon, right? Also, the world government tends to vilify people with the D initial. And so it kind of makes sense like why they would spread those rumors about Kuma being a tyrant. So yeah, if Kuma ended up being a D, then that makes sense why he lost his smile because of the world government. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I thought this chapter was really good. Let me know your thoughts about it down below, and let me know your thoughts about the points that I raised in this video as well. Thank you for all of your support. Take care. Have a good rest of the week. Good week in general. Catch you guys later. Bye.